So I thought I might start my talk today by referencing and prefacing with commentary from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Her 2009 TED Talk was called "The Danger of a Single Story." And Chimamanda is an author from Nigeria. And she says in her talk, she talks about the danger of only understanding a place as vast and differentiated as Africa through a single story, such as, for instance, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness or something, right? So she wants to talk about, actually, you have to tell lots of stories. There have to be many stories. They have to be multivalent. So they have to be plentitudinous. And I was thinking that it's true, not only that you need to have so many stories for a region, but when you look at a single story, there are so many stories to tell about a single story, as we've been doing in this semester of Their Eyes Are Watching God. Now, by the time you've come to this point in the semester, I think we've heard Professor Parks talk about linguistics. We've heard people in some of their classes talking about the book as an anthropological study. We've heard people talking about the book in book clubs. What does it mean to share a story with your good friends and talk quietly and privately about how it makes you feel on a very personal level? And so what we're going to do today is to continue telling these many, many stories. And the stories we're telling today are more academic stories. It's a different way to tell stories about a novel which has had a profound effect on the face of contemporary American literature. So I'm going to start off by talking about Zora Neale Hurston's roots. Their Eyes Are Watching God are published in 1937. But her origins, if you think about where her creative juice is getting flowing, if we're thinking about where her ideologies and values becoming established, that would be in the Harlem Renaissance. So I'm going to take us back 11 years. Whoops, that's good. It's back in the slide presentation. I'm going to take us back 11 years to 1926 to the publication of Fire. Now, Fire was a periodical, a magazine published by a small circle of artists and activists in the Harlem Renaissance. And I have in my hands an actual facsimile of the actual volume of Fire. You can go online and purchase these. This amazes me. This is a precious thing. And so this is an exciting book. So what happened is a bunch of artists get together, and it's 1926. The Harlem Renaissance is in full swing. Think about what it means to have a Harlem Renaissance. Think about Harlem as a place where a growing, burgeoning class of middle-class intellectuals, artists, doctors, lawyers, teachers, professionals are building a black city right inside of New York. Think what it means to have this kind of support, this kind of money, this kind of access to education, this kind of new artistic tradition for artists in 1926. Well, it means you have people like Elaine Locke writing. It means you have people like W.E.B. Du Bois writing. And they're writing interesting things. They're writing things like racial uplift, and that it's an artist's duty to present a unified and coherent and civilized, and we'll talk about that word, whatever that means, vision of black folk to a broader audience, which includes white folk who are either indifferent or too easily going to believe negative portrayals. So there's the kind of bourgeois, middle-class, intelligentsia visions of what black art should be, coming from a very established black intellectual tradition. So if when we come to Fire, and we look at what we have in Fire, the subtitle reads, "Devoted to the Younger Negro Artists." Oh, yes, we have a little generational something going on. And it's very interesting now to conceive of this group that, if we look at our our thing. Guess who's one of the original contributors to Fire? It's Zora Neale Hurston. And look at the company she's keeping. Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Bennett, Richard Bruce, who is really Richard Bruce Nugent, but he was doing such shocking things that he left his last name off because he didn't want his family to be too embarrassed. Aaron Douglas, and closely associated with this group are other artists like the sculptor Augusta Savage. So this is a thrilling, exciting group of artists, the younger generation getting together to create some artwork. And they're doing so with full consciousness that they're younger. And let's see what they're up to in Fire. We see that Zora Neale Hurston is writing a play called Color Struck, a play in 4 scenes. Color Struck is an interesting play. It deals with colorism. It deals with discrimination based on skin shade within the Black community itself. Oh my goodness. So for people already facing vast discrimination in a culture based on skin color, oh my goodness, this is not something Elaine Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois really want the younger Harlem artists to be considering. Ooh, how about Sweat? A story. Sweat is a very short story, very highly dramatic and beautiful, highly anthologized. For a lot of people, Sweat is the first thing by Zora Neale Hurston that they ever read. And Sweat is a story about a very hardworking African-American woman whose husband is an abuser. Well, you can be sure that the fathers of the Black intelligentsia do not want Zora Neale Hurston to talk about abuse, right? And so, you can see these younger artists are really up to something. You can see how complicated, too, the artistic scene is becoming. Because if you're Zora Neale Hurston, where do you owe your allegiance? Do you owe your allegiance to other women who are survivors of abuse? Or do you owe your allegiance to your race? So complicated, right? Zora Neale Hurston says art should be able to talk about all things. Now, when you first open the cover of Fire, there is a spiritual written by Langston Hughes. And each time it says fire, and then there's a stanza describing fire. And I like the last stanza. Hughes writes, "Fire, weaving vivid, hot designs upon an ebon-bordered loom and satisfying pagan thirst for beauty unadorned. The flesh is sweet and real, the soul an inward flush of fire. Beauty, flesh on fire in the furnace of life blazing." And then he says in there, "Fire, fire, Lord." So, Langston Hughes, famous American poet. Interesting that he's going to take a Negro spiritual as his model for writing. But let's look what he does with his spiritual. How many spirituals do you know that focus on pagan thirst? So he's taking a tradition, which you would say of all the traditions going, a spiritual is going to be about the most Christian thing out there. But no, in the hands of Langston Hughes, we're going to subvert the Christian framework of that traditional genre and turn it to pagan purposes. And what else are we interested in? We're interested in flesh. The flesh is sweet. So also a giving over of an ideology that would focus on spirit and talk about flesh. Flesh as a legitimate vector of being. And then finally, and with a capital B, and I'll keep coming back to again and again, beauty. Beauty above all. And so it's interesting to me that one of the things that we see trumpeted forth in Fire, this new periodical, is the idea of beauty. It's an art for art's sake ideology that says art does not have to work in the service of social uplift. Art does not have to work in the service of any other discipline. Art is its own thing. Beauty is reason enough for its existence. So we come to the first page. This is the spread you get. It has the lovely illustration by Richard Bruce Nugent. And I love how the sweep of how the line of the poem is continued over into the big title with the little lines, the decorative lines helping to weigh. Nice framework, very scant indication of where we are, somewhere with palm trees and somewhere with near a swamp or a marsh because of the cattails, but otherwise just beautifully evoked scenery, very minimal, and then this nice border coming along. That's a very African border. That's a theme or a motif that doesn't come from Art Nouveau. It's not quite like anything we've seen in Art Deco. It's not quite like anything we see in classical representations. So it's just a subtle way to say, we're messing about with what a white audience might have been trained up to see as traditional artistic elements. And I don't know if you noticed, the first story in Fire is called Cordelia the Crude. So we are going to find beauty. We are going to celebrate all aspects of life. We are not going to discount, reject some aspects as not worthy of the artist's thought. And here's the opening paragraph. Physically, if not mentally, Cordelia was a potential prostitute, meaning that although she had not yet realized the moral import of her wanton promiscuity, nor become mercenary, she had nevertheless become quite blasé and bountiful in the matter of bestowing sexual favors upon persuasive and likely young men. So imagine what the black bourgeois intelligentsia is, how they're reacting to this. Oh my God! Really? Don't you understand our struggle? Don't you understand? You can't go around portraying young black women as potential prostitutes. What are you thinking? Fire, right? That's what we're thinking. We're messing with tradition. We are overthrowing bourgeois values of morality, and we are pursuing beauty. We are pursuing art for art's sake. I love this picture of the person in the illustration. The illustrations are incidental. They're not necessarily meant to illustrate the story that they're attached to or located nearby. But this particular painting by Richard Bruce Nugent, I love because if you look at the woman, it's not only celebrating contrast, black and white, not only celebrating the contrast of the hard, diagonal, jagged pattern against the languid, flowing. I mean, have you ever, people aren't actually like this. It's so languid and flowing, celebrating the contrast between her flowing lines and the harsh lines. And then look at her hair, right? A celebration of a truly African-American female beauty. Here's another one by Richard Bruce Nugent, and a lot of the same techniques are in play, right? You have an abstract African design framing the sensuous, languid figure of the nude, and look at her. Oops, go back, there she is. Can you imagine with just so few lines that a face is sketched in? That's all the lines it takes to have such a distinctive face drawn in. A few squiggles of your paintbrush, and you have a woman with an afro. You have someone who is not from a Greek tradition, not a golden-haired Victorian cherub, right? You have a distinct and new style of beauty to be celebrated. So I think it's interesting to have a figure of a nude, and then to have the African frame. I'm kind of interested in the way the fire kind of frames a lot of ideas, the way you can rework a spiritual to frame some ideas. And I'm interested in the way you can add an African border to reframe some ideas. One of the things we always say about Their Eyes Are Watching God, commentators always talk on, is the idea that there are two very distinct voices in Their Eyes Are Watching God. As Henry Louis Gates puts it in the afterword, the critical essay that's in this version of the book, as he puts it, there is the very highly articulate voice of the omniscient narrator, and omniscient is our fancy way of saying all-knowing. And then there's the highly idiomatic language of Janie, who is our first-person narrator. And so what I love is that point in chapter 2 where Janie takes over the narrative and begins to speak. And the first thing that Janie says, as she's sitting down with her friend Phoebe, she says, "I know exactly what I got to tell you, but it's hard to know where to start at." So what interests me in a passage like this is it's about knowledge. She knows exactly what to say, but she doesn't know where to start out. So the first thing that when we look really closely at the text, we see that Hurston is picturing Janie, fashioning Janie, as someone who's in the middle of an epistemological crisis. Now, we use epistemology. That just means the philosophy of knowledge, the nature of knowledge, what sorts of things can be known, what are the boundaries or reaches of knowledge, what constitutes knowledge. So that's epistemology. It's a $5 word. Use it in your next essay. It'd be awesome. Totally do that. So it's an epistemological quandary. She has knowledge, but she doesn't know how to get it to come out. But it's not only an epistemological quandary, it's the terror of the blank page. So anybody who's ever sat down to write a poem, to try to write a story, faced with the terror of the blank page, it's also a specifically creative dilemma. How do you start your grand opus? How do you begin a work? How do you make? How do you create? I would say as an artist. So this is what Henry Louis Gates has to say. He looks at the distinction between this literate, third-person, omniscient narrator's voice and then Janie's much more idiomatic use of the vernacular. And Gates concludes that it's a divided voice, a double voice, unreconciled. And it strikes Gates as her great achievement, a verbal analog of her double experiences as a woman in a male-dominated world, and as a black person in a non-black world. A woman writer's revision of W.E.B. Du Bois' metaphor of double consciousness for the hyphenated African American. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois remains a big and important founding voice in black criticism. But what's interesting to me is, don't forget that Zora Neale Hurston, her allegiances are to her circle of firebrand artists and fire. I remember that part of their stated purpose is they are going against the bourgeois, black intelligentsia ideas of sobriety, moderation, social uplift, reform. Right? They are decidedly not going to be middle class and moral. They reject bourgeois. They embrace Cordelia the Crude. Right? They want their spirituals to be pagan and about beauty. So first of all, I would remind you that it may be that she's actively set against people like W.E.B. Du Bois because they reflect a new they're the system, right? So she's trying to embody a rejection of Du Bois' precepts. All right, and just to remind us really hard again about what fire is about, this is Richard Bruce Nugent's story. Because he did those beautiful illustrations, but he also wrote a story, and his story is called Smoke, Jade, and Lilies. And in this story, the speaker, is a first-person speaker, has an interesting dilemma. He's in love with he's a black male, and he's in love with a beautiful black woman named Melva. But at the same time, he's also in love with a beautiful Hispanic boy that he calls Beauty. So you can see he's like, And this is what Richard Bruce, this is a style of writing he's using back in 1926 in this Firebrand magazine. He writes, Beauty's body had pressed close, close. Fire's going to burn my soul. That's from Langston Hughes' Spiritual, right? Let's leave. Have to meet some people at the New World. It's a club, right? Then to Augusta's party, Augusta Savage. Remember Augusta. We're going to come back and revisit Augusta in a little bit. Langston Hughes, Connie, John, Bruce, Harold, ready, down 135th Street. Fire, Lord. Now to Augusta's party. Fire is going to burn my soul. He felt the bed sink as Beauty lay beside him. His lips were dry, hot. Yeah, that's got him kind of squirming up there in happy black intellectual land, doesn't it? One of the first overtly homoerotic works by a black author, right? So celebrating his love for beauty. And what interests me a lot about this, as if, all that's not interesting enough, is look at this interesting way that Bruce Nugent writes. You see all these ellipses? Like, what's up with that? Well, a very, very easy explanation would be, well, it's the modern period, and the moderns are all about Freud and this discovery of stream of consciousness, and so basically what you have with the ... dots are the leaps in thinking, the leaps in logic. So they represent the omissions where everything is not spelled out because you don't speak to yourself like Shakespeare in your own head too often, right? So otherwise they call the doctors. But so long as you're putting in ellipses to represent those huge leaps of thought, the scattering, the stream of consciousness, that's a beautiful literary technique, right? To accomplish some kind of meaning, to represent meaning. And here I took a photograph of the way the story ends. And it ends with, Melva had said, and don't make me blush again, and kissed him. And the street had been blue. One can love too at the same time. Melva had kissed him. One can. And the street had been blue. One can. And the room was clouded with blue smoke, drifting vapors of smoke and thoughts. Beauty's hair was so black and soft. Blue smoke from an ivory holder. Was that why he loved Beauty? One can. Or because his body was beautiful and white and warm. Or because his eyes. One can love ... And so it ends with like 8 dots by the time we get to the conclusion of the story. And as if 8 dots to indicate continuation is not enough, I love, he says at the bottom, to be continued, ... And so the ellipses as a way to represent stream of consciousness, of course, but also an ellipses as a way of showing things are a little bit forbidden, right? We can talk about the beauty of Beauty's body, but we don't want to talk about it too much. And some of those things are probably not printable. But the ellipses also, they're a thing of beauty. So if you just cast your eye over the paragraph, it looks good on a page. It looks good to see a story, a structure broken up like this. People talk about modernization and the fragmentation of consciousness all the time. I'm going to suggest something a little different because, I'm angling to disagree with Henry Louis Gates, who wants to talk about the divided voice and the unreconciled voice. I want to say, from the very beginning, Zora Neale Hurston is with a group of people who are not either or. You can love two at the same time. And even today, it's hard to find people who believe that moral perspective, right? That you can love. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and. And not only both and, it can be multiplicities compounded upon multiplicities. So I'm going to start developing an idea about Zora Neale Hurston as an author who is not divided, who is not fragmented, but who is multiplicitous, who is abundant, who is going to overwhelm us with bountiness. Is that a word? I like it. Bountiness of her thought, her impressions of beauty, and that it will all cohere. It's not fragmented. So if you look in your books, if you have them, look on page 158 through 159. It's a rather long passage. And in this passage, the hurricane is bearing down. It starts back on 157. The hurricane is bearing down. The people are gathering in the cabin to while away the time. And most of the great flamethrowers were there, and naturally handling Big John the Conqueror in his works. So imagine flamethrowers. People tell stories. I love that stories of flames, fire going to burn me, Lord, right? How had he done everything big on earth and went up to heaven without dying at all? Went up there picking a guitar, got all the angels doing the ring shout round and round the throne. So, telling stories, the ring shout. Then everybody but God and old Peter flew off on a flying race to Jericho and back, and John the Conqueror won the race. Went on down to hell, beat the old devil, passed out, ice-watered everybody down there. Somebody tried to say it was a mouth organ harp that John was playing, but the rest of them would not hear that. Don't care how good anybody could play a harp, God would rather hear a guitar. That brought them back to tea cake. How come he couldn't lick that box of liquor too? Well, all right now, make us know it. When it got good to everybody, now we got music, right? And the various, which of the musics is going to be better. When it got good to everybody, Muck Boy woke up and began to chant with the rhythm, and everybody bore down on the last word of the line. Your mama don't wear no drawers. I seen her when she took them off. She soaked them in alcohol. She sold them to Sandy Claus. He told her 'twas against the law to wear them dirty drawers. So now we got chanting. We got the wonderful dexterity of the traditional chant. Then Muck Boy went crazy through the feet, danced himself and everybody else crazy. And when he finished, he sat back down on the floor and went to sleep again. Then they got to play in Florida Flip and Coon Can. Then it was dice, not for money. This was a show-off game. Everybody posing as fancy shots. As always, it broiled down to tea cake and motorboat. Tea cake with his shy grin and motorboat with his face like a little black cherubim just from a church tower doing amazing things with anybody's dice. The others forgot the work and the weather watching them throw. It was art. So, Zora Neale Hurston is being very literal. She's being explicit. She's coming right out and telling us in no uncertain terms whatsoever that this is art. These things we've just seen, dice throwing, chanting, the circle stomp, the guitar playing, all of it is art. These ordinary things. And now I'm thinking back to Cordelia the Crude, and I'm thinking about sweat, and I'm thinking about pagan spirituals, and I'm thinking, this is very revolutionary. This is really, really revolutionary stuff to see. Ordinary moments of black life as art. So, when we think about Janie then as an artist, someone interested in creation, when she finishes her story, Phoebe says, Lord, Phoebe breathed out heavily, I done grow 10 feet higher from just listening to you, Janie. I ain't satisfied with myself no more. And so, art for art's sake, sure. But what Hurston dramatizes for us is how art is a contract between a creator and a receiver, an audience. And so one of the things that happens with Phoebe is art changed her. Looking at a life, an ordinary black life, changed her, made her feel 10 feet higher. Janie has to admonish Phoebe. Oh, it's okay, because Phoebe's like growing full of beauty. And Janie says, now Phoebe, don't feel too mean with the rest of them, because they's parched up from not knowing things. And we get back to the knowing, to the epistemological puzzle of the status of knowledge. What counts as knowledge? Can a story about life be knowledge? She says, Janie does, in conclusion, this is the last thing Janie says in the story. It's a known fact, Phoebe, that you got to go there to know there. Your papa and your mama and nobody else can't tell you and show you. 2 things everybody's got to do for themselves. They got to go to God and they got to find out about living for themselves. There was a finished silence after that, because it was a work of art. It was finished. It was not only complete, but with a high degree of finish. So attention paid to the aesthetic quality of it as well. So not only to what was being accomplished in sharing and telling the story, but also attention to the surface, to the finish, to the shine, to the aesthetic development of the story. So if you think back to the very famous passage of Janie under the pear tree and how the pear tree becomes a kind of ruling metaphor for the story, everybody jumps on that and talks about, it talks about the virgin snowy blossoms, it talks about the buzzing of the bees, it talks about the bees creaming in the pollen. Yeah, it's pretty sexual. So people say it's a story about Janie becoming an adult sexually. It's a story about Janie pursuing romantic love. It's a story about Janie pursuing sexual fulfillment and love. It's a story about Janie, last time when Professor Parks was talking, he says it's a story about Janie seeking communion with another person linguistically through the sharing of a story, right? So as a kind of social sharing. Well, if we look at that, those passages, I think it's also very much, I guess we're on page 11 or so. It's also very much, to me, a story about the unfurling, the flowering of an artistic sensibility. She says on page 10, it stirred her tremendously. How and why? It was like a flute song, forgotten in another existence and remembered again. What, how, why? The singing she heard had nothing to do with her ears. It followed her through all her waking moments and caressed her in her sleep. It connected itself with other vaguely felt matters that had struck her outside observation and buried themselves in her flesh. Now they emerged and quested about her consciousness. So this is also a story of how are you going to create a work of art that adds to knowledge, that creates knowledge. Janie felt as though she had been summoned to behold a revelation. After a while, she got up from where she was and went over to a little garden field and tired. She was seeking confirmation of the voice and the vision. This sounds like an artist speaking, right? Confirmation of the voice and the vision. That's, to me, not quite as sexual as some of the other imagery might lead us to believe. Everywhere she found and acknowledged answers. She's on a quest to know. A personal answer for all other creations except herself. She searched as much of the world as she could from the top of the front steps and went on down the front gate, leaned over to gaze up and down the road, looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made. She is an artist. She's thinking about creation. She's waiting for the world to be made. It's in passive voice right now. What's fun is to watch how the passive-voiced female waiting for the world to be made becomes the active-voice narrator telling her own story in her own voice. And one of the things this Janie narrator often notes is it all depends how you construct it. And so she says it was all according to the way you see things. Some people could look at a mud puddle and see an ocean with ships. So this is a woman coming into her powers, and it's true. It's maturity, it's sexual, it's independence, it's all these things. But it's also a narrator coming into her power. It's a narrator understanding the power to tell a story, to turn ordinary life into art. So this is one of her early examples. Through the pollinated air, she saw a glorious being coming up the road. In her former blindness, she had known him as shiftless Johnny Taylor, tall and lean. That was before the golden dust of pollen had beglamored his rags in her eyes. So she kisses him, and her granny sees. This is terrible. Her granny says, "What I seen just now is plenty for me, honey. I don't want no trash Negro, no brick and britches like Johnny Taylor using your body to wipe his feet on." That's enough to make you never have sex again, ever. Right? Is that really, that's what the that using your body to wipe his feet on? That is a terrible way and to understand sex, the sexual act. But what do we know about Granny? What do we know happened to her? What do we know happened to Janie's mother? So context is everything for people who speak their experiences. Nanny's words made Janie's kiss across the gatepost seem like a manure pile after a rain. Wow, so our stories, the way we tell them, the way we construct them for other people, has an impact on other people. They can make you feel like a manure pile, or they can make you feel like you done grow 10 feet taller just listening. So that's the power that Janie is learning about. So when she first sits down and she's meeting her old kissing friend Phoebe, and they're sharing good times from the past, she says, Phoebe says, "It's hard for me to understand what you mean the way you tell it. Then again, I'm hard of understanding at times." So Phoebe's trying to put it all on herself. But Janie says, "No, tain't nothing like you might think. So tain't no use in me telling you something unless I give you the understanding to go along with it." So this quest for knowledge, this quest for understanding that we can create, that it has a responsibility from the artist, and it has a responsibility from the audience as well. And this is what she says. Janie says, "Phoebe, we've been kissing friends for 20 years, so I depend on you for a good thought, and I'm talking to you from that standpoint." She can't tell her story unless she's going to get a good thought from Phoebe. She has to have a receptive audience. She's dependent on you. So Henry Louis Gates Jr. wants to talk about an unresolved tension between the double voices, and that the use of the two voices celebrates the psychological fragmentation of both modernity and Black consciousness. But I want to argue, no, it's a coming into being, it's a learning, it's a coming into a power. In her essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, in 1928, which is just 2 years after the publication of Fire, Zora Neale Hurston is saying, "I belong to no race or time. I am cosmic Zora Neale Hurston. I have no separate feeling about being an American citizen and colored." She's flat out saying, "No, you can't rewrite my story that way, Mr. Henry Gates Lewis Jr., because I feel like sometimes I am cosmic. I don't feel divided. I don't feel two." What she says is, "I feel like a brown bag of miscellany propped up against a wall." And she says, "And in my brown bag of miscellany, there are objects, both priceless, small objects, both priceless and worthless." So when we look at the famous opening lines, we have that omniscient, all-knowing narrator. And what the omniscient, all-knowing narrator tells us is that ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. That is the life of men. Now women forget all those things they don't want to remember. So the first thing the omniscient narrator tells us is that this omniscient narrator knows a lot of things. They're going to tell us truths about the world. And the truths about the world is that there are two kinds of knowledge, and knowledge is gender. There's the kind of knowledge that men bear, and there's the kind of knowledge that women bear. Now, if we look at the very last thing that Janie says at the end of her travels, at the end of her beautiful creation, this narrative of her life, she says, "It's a known fact, Phoebe, you got to go there to know there. Your mama and your papa can't tell you." So she's saying no to a gendered structure of knowledge. She's saying nobody else can tell you and show you. Two things everybody's got to do. So she rejects two kinds of knowledge that the omniscient narrator creates for us at the outset and comes together for a more unified idea about knowledge that is inclusive. Everybody's got to find out these things for themselves. So what she's doing is she's subverting the omniscient narrator. So the omniscient narrator, the whole purpose of an omniscient narrator is their third-person perspective. They're all-knowing. They're removed from the narrative. But what Janie does is she tells a narrative that is so strong that she ends up seducing the omniscient narrator to thinking just like she thinks. So by the end, the closing of the book, the omniscient narrator says, "Then Tea Cake came prancing around her. Tea Cake with the sun for a shawl. Of course he wasn't dead. He could never be dead until she herself had finished thinking or feeling." So the separate, remote, omniscient narrator has become entirely identified with Janie and Janie's perspectives, to the point that this omniscient narrator who knows all the truths of the world is going to start laying them out for you in the opening chapter. This omniscient narrator is now like, and Tea Cake is alive. So it's an utter subversion of the frame narrative and its usual stance as the objective point of view, the objective perspective.